Chess Diagnostic.
Hello, and welcome to my game analysis of a game between Magnus Carlsen and Aronian at the 2017, I think it's called the Grenke Chess Classic. It's going on in Germany right now, and this is a very interesting round 2 game that resulted in a draw, but Magnus was winning at one point, and he plays some brilliant moves in this game. And even the end game is very interesting, where Aronian has to find the right moves to get the draw. So it starts off with e4, and it's a Rye Lopez. It's actually an anti-marshal system. Aronian wanted to play the marshal defense, where he sacks a pawn but gets a crazy kingside attack. But modern grandmasters don't really allow that because it's very dangerous for the white player. It's much harder to play when you're under attack. So after these normal moves in the Rye Lopez, where the player is just developing, after a4 and d3, this is kind of a standard anti-marshal where it doesn't allow black to play d5. So you notice that Magnus Carlsen is just trying to gain space on the queen side and develop his pieces as effectively for control in the center. After h6, he moves his bishop back. And this move appears that it might be a little weakening, but because of this bishop and the undeveloped queenside pieces, it's actually quite effective. He gains space on the king side. He's able to trade one of the bishops and gain the bishop pair. So you can see that even though his pawns are a little weak, there's really nothing that white can do to exploit it at this point. So we're just still developing pieces, and basically we're in the middle game at this point. After knight to e3 and bishop to e6, all the pieces are developed, and all white has to do is move his queen, and we've connected the rooks. And in the middle game, they're basically playing in the center. Now, this bishop is a little awkward, and he has to trade it. So he trades it, but he gives black this semi-open file. And now black can put pressure on f2, and with his dark square bishop, notice that white doesn't have a bishop, so this dark square bishop actually puts a lot of pressure on this diagonal. So Magnus moved queen to c2, connecting the rooks. And now it's actually Aronian who is starting kingside pawn thrust. So after rook trade, Magnus has this open B file that he uses to penetrate on the queen side, but he's going to go under an attack, and he has to figure out how to meet it accurately. So he trades pawns, but now h3 is coming, and he has to figure out how to meet it. One thing that he could do, the computer is suggesting that we move the knight back, but actually Magnus goes to increase his activity on the queen side with rook to b7. With h3 and rook takes c7, he's threatening a minor piece, but after pawn takes pawn, the queen is threatening to take this knight, and then if bishop takes e3, for example, after rook takes and then queen takes, then this pawn is proving to be a lot of trouble. Black is threatening bishop takes knight and then queen to f1 check. So the only way to meet that is d4. But after the bishop takes, the threat is still on, and actually at this point he's losing because of this passed pawn. So the only way to meet it is to actually give up a piece. And at this point, the end of the line, white is down a piece and a pawn, and he's basically lost. So, of course, Magnus Carlsen saw that. We're back at this position. And instead of just taking the knight, he played the brilliant move, queen to e2. And now if the queen takes, for example, queen takes f3, then he can actually make a trade, take the pawn, and now he's threatening the rook. Now the rook at this point will take the knight, and now it looks like black is up 2 pieces for a rook, but the knight is forced to go here, an inactive position, and this pawn mass proves an advantage for white. So we don't get that line in the game. It actually goes like this. So after queen to e2, black saves his own knight with knight to e7. Magnus brings his knight back here because he wants to take this pawn with a knight. Now, he doesn't want to allow the bishop to take here, but he could because the queen can take it. And now the knight is going to take g7, and he doesn't really have any problems. All right, so after knight to e1, black plays rook to b8, trying to use the b file to penetrate for his own purposes. Now, the computer's suggesting queen to f3, but Magnus goes for a more aggressive option with queen to g4. So after queen to g4 and knight to g6, this is actually a mistake because now Magnus can break through in the center and put pressure on the king side. So first off, he activates his knight again, and then he starts playing in the center to gain activity for his knights. He wants to bring this knight into the game. And now this is kind of a typical Magnus maneuver where he'll use a pawn break to increase his piece's activity, even just using pawns to break through and clear squares. So he starts with d4, and now after the pawn takes, he plays e5. Now if the pawn takes, then the knight could just take, but he brings another piece into the game. Knight to c4. Now the knights are coming to e5 and putting a lot of pressure on this pin piece. Rook to b8. Now the king takes the pawn. And notice that because of these pawn moves, the bishop is cut off and the rook is threatening the bishop as well. So he actually has Aronian has quite a lot of problems at this point. Now the strongest continuation is simply knight from f to e5, putting pressure on this piece. And now if the pawn takes, threatening to queen, the rook can actually take the bishop, and it looks like a queen trade will be forced. But at this point, the pawns are so weak that he'll win some, and then he'll just simply be up a piece. So this is the end of that line. But we don't get that line, and actually Magnus makes a mistake. So instead of knight from f to e5, which is a simple attack and move for activity, he actually plays queen takes e4. Now we know from our understanding of activity that you want to use all your pieces to increase your activity and make either checks, captures, or threats. Basically, you want to attack the opponent with every single piece you have. Now, queen takes e4 should be an obvious mistake because it reduces the pressure of the pin and it doesn't increase the activity of the knight. So after queen takes e4, now this knight is free to attack the king. And it's actually a forced draw at this point, although it's very difficult because the knight's increasing his activity and the queen can force a trade. So after pawn takes, if the rook takes the bishop, which it does, then we actually get a very unique ending with a rook and a knight versus a queen. So white has to figure out a way to stop the queening of the pawn or to trade material. So he does that by threatening the king, and now the rook has to give itself up. But after this, black gets a queen. He's going to win one of the knights back because of the numerous checks, but we end up with a position with a rook and a knight with a pawn versus a lone queen and a king. So after these trades, black has to be very careful to prevent the queening of this pawn. Of course, Magnus wants to create kind of a fortress where he can usher in his pawn, but black is able to prevent it. Of course, not queen takes rook, because then we'll queen this pawn. Oh, here we go. So after rook to d7, black plays queen to c5. White is trying to find a way to drive the black queen away so he can move his king out of the way and get this pawn up. So finally, the king has come forward, and it looks like this pawn is going to be ushered in. But black, because of his queen, has a lot of checks. Now this is very interesting. So the rook is checking the king and the queen, but after king to b8, if, for example, he takes the queen, it's actually stalemate because the knight is covering these squares. And so we actually get a draw because there's no way for white to actually usher his pawn in. He basically just has to keep moving his rook and checking, and if he moves his king, then he's going to get checked himself. So a draw was agreed at this point because there's no way to make progress. Alright, overall a very interesting game by Magnus Carlsen and Aronian. If you have any questions about the analysis, leave a message, leave a comment, and be sure to subscribe. I'll see you in the future.